Right, we might as well get started because we're running a bit behind time. It's really interesting to hear some of these talks downstairs as you go into sort of more remote parts of Australia, and onto Indigenous land. There's a lot of different issues out there. So I'm going to talk about the involvement of traditional owners in market-based instruments in regional natural resource management. I work between two groups. I work at Charles Darwin University doing research and development and related to wildlife-based enterprise development. And I also work and apply this stuff through the Land Council, Northern Land Council. Just to acknowledge some of my colleagues, Sivaram Vemuri, who works in the School of Law and Business, and Neil Collins, who's a program leader with the Alanjara Wallara National Resource Management Board. So this is what I'm going to talk about today. I'll give you a bit of context and some of the limitations of this presentation, and then I'll talk about NRM and the use of MBIs in the Northern Territory, and how traditional owners have actually been involved to date in MBIs, and just very quickly about how things are changing and how to better to deliver MBIs. And then I'll talk about NRM in South Australia and some of the threats to natural resource management there, and how some changes to the delivery of MBIs might actually be able to increase involvement of traditional owners in NRM. And then I'll give some suggestions to how to improve uptake, governance and delivery of MBIs by traditional owners. So regional Australia actually comprises the area outside all the capital cities. It's 99% of Australia's landmass, right up from the tropics right down to sort of temperate Tasmania, and it actually includes about 1/3 of Australia's population, which is 7 million people. So it plays a regional important contribution to Australia's economic and cultural life, and also to the prosperity in the global context. As I'm sure you're all aware, there's 56 NRM regions covering Australia, and Aboriginal people exist in most of these NRM regions, and actually involved a lot of the time in NRM. I'm going to talk about the Northern Territory, which actually is covered by one NRM board, the Territory Natural Resource Management Board, as well as talk about the Alanjara Wallara Natural Resource Management Board. So just two of the NRM boards in regional Australia. So it's going to be based on those two areas. Both of these areas have exploited and structurally intact landscapes, which are very rich in biodiversity and cultural diversity. And there's a lot of Aboriginal people living traditionally on land in these areas. And so when you're talking about NRM, it's really important to talk to the right people and involve the right people. Most importantly, a lot of the areas in regional Australia have very different governance, funding and support networks when it comes to NRM. So I'll just give you a quick definition of what a traditional owner is, according to the Aboriginal Land Rights Act 1976, and also in relation to land. It refers to it's all about a local descent group of Aboriginals who have a common spiritual affiliation to a site on the land that places that group under primary spiritual responsibility for the site, and there's also entitles them to forage as a right over that land. So in the Northern Territory, NRM has been done in a variety of different ways. Some of them include Indigenous Protected Areas. There's 40 Indigenous Protected Areas across Australia, 8 of them in the Northern Territory. They make up about 25%, 23% of Australia's natural reserve system. There's also Indigenous Ranger groups, which are paid to provide certain environmental services, such as weeds, feral and fire management. And there's joint managed national parks and reserves. And there's going to be 34 in the Northern Territory into the future, and these are in the process of being devised at the moment, how they're going to run the joint management component of it. So through NRM in the Northern Territory has actually managed to engage fairly successfully with traditional owners, but there's been a number of policy and legislative changes that are affecting Aboriginal people on country, and so things are changing, and there might be a need to do things differently into the future. In terms of making land management decisions, there's designated people within clans who actually make decisions and who have authority for land management. You have the Trisha owners, who are generally from the father's side, and they make decisions for the country. And then you have Jungai, who are the actual physical land managers. That's a term that's used in the Yolngu language group in Eastern Arnhem Land. So cultural input into land management outcomes are very important, and in recent times this has been conducted quite successfully through the Indigenous Ranger groups. So they a lot of the time the Indigenous Ranger groups are doing much of the land management on behalf of these Trisha owners and Jungai, and quite often these important decision makers are part of the Ranger groups, but that's not always the case. Ranger groups used to be funded, or they used to be part of a community development employment program scheme, and that sort of gave quite a bit of flexibility to the Ranger scheme, and actually allowed for Trisha owners to be allowed for quite a bit of flow from the community to the Ranger groups, and potential for TO involvement. Regardless, Rangers actually make sure the right people are consulted when they do land management, and now Ranger programs, when they're getting funded salaries, there's less people involved in the Ranger programs, and potentially in some areas less opportunity to actually interact with the community. So there's a possibility that there's less Trisha involvement in land management in some places. An example of marker-based instruments that's used quite commonly up in the Northern Territory, especially over the last decade or so, is payment for environmental services. And if you go by the exact definition, as per WANDA and C4, it's a voluntary transaction, which is a well-defined environmental service that's bought by a minimum of one environmental service buyer for a minimum of one environmental service provider, from a minimum of one service provider. And then the payment only happens if the environmental service provider secures the environmental service provision, so conditionality. Now, we actually prefer a more commonly used term up there in the Northern Territory is fee for service, and it's a much broader term, and it relates to a wider range of land management services that aren't really identified as environmental services. So that can involve stuff like coastal surveillance or fencing, road work, maintenance of sacred sites, fire breaks. So fee for service is a much broader suite of activities, and PES is part of that, just to explain. So the Indigenous Land and Sea Ranger groups, Northern Territory is about 1.346 million square kilometres. 50% of that area is actually Aboriginal owned land, so it's a massive area. And there's about 30 Land and Sea Ranger groups that are employed to manage that country in the top bit, in the top part of the Northern Territory. And in Central Australia, there's about 7 ranger groups that employ about 70 Aboriginal people to do the management. The Indigenous Ranger program was initiated in the 1990s in the top end, and it's contributed quite greatly to the health of the country and its ecosystem services. As I said earlier on, it's the Ranger programs operated as a CDP activity through the Caring for Country unit of the Northern Land Council, and it's considered to be a merger of Aboriginal and Western management, and it's actually served the NRM goals as well as community aspirations. So for the last sort of 20 years, when it was running as a CDP activity, the system was fairly flexible and sort of gave people opportunity to carry on involvement in custom and ceremony. So actually loosely, the range activities could be considered as a form of payment for environmental service, because the rangers provided these services voluntarily, and the funding was often based on particular outcomes, so it had additionality. It continued for a number of years, so there was conditional transaction and involved one buyer, one seller, and a well-defined environmental service. Over the last 10 years, there's been a number of events that have actually allowed payment for environmental service or fee-for-service activities to become an increasing important tool. There's been a much greater acknowledgement of Indigenous natural and cultural resource management, and there's been a lot of issues in more conventional land management that have arisen, such as native species lost, increase of wildfire, biodisease. There's been a whole range of those type of things. There's also been an increase in activities that could be made into a contract, a PES or fee-for-service contract, such as there's been an increase in legal fishing vessels, threats of biodisease from avian flu and tuberculosis and those types of things. There's always feral pests, such as fire ants, that need to be controlled. And then there's carbon abatement, and most of you might be aware of the West Arnhem Fire Abatement Scheme and Central Arnhem ones that are coming about. So those are some of the more recent sort of activities that are now classed as PES or fee-for-service activities. There's also a whole range of other things related to neighbouring properties such as fencing and roadworks and that type of stuff. There's also been acknowledgement of the difficulties and the expense of non-local people providing these NRM activities, and more recently a greater awareness of the social plight of Indigenous Australians. So the low levels of employment, education, health, and through the government intervention and closing the gap, I guess some of these other employment opportunities have come about. There's also been this change in Commonwealth funding accountability. So as you've moved from the Natural Heritage Trust funding to the Caring for Our Country funding, so things have become more activity-based. When it was NHT, there was Indigenous Ranger programs that were funded as a whole. As it's moved to Caring for Our Country, they've started to take out pieces of those activities within those programs and start putting them into contracts so that they can pay for the outcome. So these are just a few of the activities that are now done as fee-for-service activities that might have been done within a Ranger program in the past. So these activities would be in contracts that the groups sort of sign up to do and get paid on them being done. So fire management, such as the fire abatement stuff, and with outcomes to reduce carbon. And I should say that when you're talking about these sort of activities, the outcomes that you're asking, the outcomes that you're wanting, such as this fire abatement, reduction in carbon, might be sometimes quite different to the outcomes that traditional owners want. So people might generally use fire to clear country for hunting, or a variety of other reasons. And so it's important that the goals that are lined up in these payment for environmental service contracts align with the traditional owners. And those fire abatement programs are very much aligned with traditional owners' expectations and aspirations. So there's weed control, there's AQUIS work, coastal management, the whole range of different activities that are now classed as fee-for-service activities or payment for environmental service activities, fencing, fire breaks, water quality monitoring, the whole range of them. So what are the factors that influence uptake of fee-for-service work? Well, different groups are involved in these activities, and partly it's dependent on the geographic position. So the proximity of neighbouring pastoral properties or joint managed national parks, mining companies, areas of threat, these are all potential buyers. So whether the ranger group is on the edge of Aboriginal land with a range of different other neighbours that could actually get them to actually provide these services is one of the reasons. The natural and cultural values of the country, so whether the areas of high conservation values or are in need of rehabilitation, the capacity of the ranger group, and the coordinators plays a crucial role here, and the coordinator's ability to go out and solicit this type of work and actually manage it and is a determining factor. The accessibility of the groups, transaction costs. I think Phil was talking about transaction costs, and it's a major contributor here. It's quite often only government departments who can actually go out there and connect with Aboriginal communities. You only have you can actually put in the people to go out there and make the connections, because it's all about connections. Endorsement from the traditional owners in the community, and ideology of the funding body. In the Northern Territory, some of the rangers are funded through Indigenous Land Corporation, some are funded for work on country. And the ideologies of these funding bodies are different. ILC want the ranger groups to become economically self-sustainable, so they say, please go ahead and promote enterprise development. It is not the same with the work on country funded rangers. So how should fee-for-service evolve? Well, initially, fee-for-service appears to be very much sort of a price-based, market-based instrument, where the government is the main funder of these activities. But over time, you'd expect and you would hope that it would swing much more towards a market-based approach, where the markets broaden and other people become involved. And I guess for this to happen, there's a few caveats. You need a framework. You need buyers to be able to select services and communicate with sellers. You need sellers to be able to package the different activities and be able to cost and manage these services and deliver on them. And you also need, and it would be nice to have certain incentives from governments to actually encourage external buyers. So are MBIs being used at their best potential in the Northern Territory at the moment? Well, in most instances, in terms of pairs, there's limited buyers. It's mainly government, and there's limited sellers, mainly rangers. So the ranger groups are the place where generally speaking, the government bodies will go to first to make these contracts. And there's a lot of other people outside the ranger groups who could actually benefit from these arrangements. There's little opportunity to grow the number of buyers, because activities aren't packaged and the pathway is difficult. So once again, coming back to those high transaction costs. And the broader community would find it difficult to actually participate because they don't have the capacity, they don't have the knowledge or equipment, and they don't understand the MBI language. The MBI language is pretty complex, even for people whose English is the first language and have been to university, let alone people who English is the third or fourth language and haven't sort of been around a market-based economy at all. So there's also a threat that cultural knowledge might not be harnessed because the rangers are in a progressively more closed system. It's not. I mean, this is just something that might be more into the future. I think at the moment there's still quite a connection between the ranger groups and traditional owners, but it might be something that happens in the future. So there could be a lot greater social benefits to Indigenous communities through fee-for-service if it were delivered differently. So what do MBIs need to work? This is something I got from the Designer Carrot's website. So in natural resource management, MBIs work by providing a framework for market exchange between buyers of environmental services and the willing sellers of environmental services. So under an MBI framework, buyers of environmental services are provided with a marketplace in which to choose the best value outcome, and land managers and others are given a business incentive to become suppliers or sellers of innovative environmental services. So what's missing in the Northern Territory? Well, there's no pathway, there's no platform, there's no free market, there's no coordination. So what's needed is an interface for buyers to connect, a clearinghouse for providers to actually lodge the service, and then appropriate training, governance and ownership. So you need to involve Indigenous natural and cultural resource management instead of just NRM. So that cultural and customary input is very important to consider when you're thinking about outcomes. And understanding of the process, that's going to take a lot of training and mentoring. So at the moment, you've got very much the Commonwealth NRM departments and the territory government that are the FSS buyers, or payment for environmental services buyers. But there's a whole range of other buyers out there. There's local governments and shires. There's departments of related fields. There's a whole lot of benefits from NRM that related to health and education, and there might be buyers from those areas that might come into the mix. And private enterprise, there's pastoral, mining, tourism, research, conservation agencies, philanthropic groups, bio-traders, or offset traders, research groups. There's a whole range of other buyers out there, but you've got to go out there and attract those buyers, and you've got to give them a framework for them to connect. So one idea of having an interface, it might be through someone like the NRM board, the Territory NRM board, for example, which have a fantastic website, and buyers could actually connect with sellers through that website. On the ground, there's a lot of different ways that people work on the ground. There's existing ranger groups that might be, or there's community hubs that might coordinate these type of approaches, and they might connect through their own website or through an interface. So how do you ensure traditional owners' involvement in MBIs? You've got to invest in the planning. You've got to make sure, and you've got to make it easy for FSF contracts to be devised, so that you can't use a one size fits all approach, and because Aboriginal communities are complex places. There's a complex mix of factors that make them tick. Their culture, the history of how they got how they were formed originally, who's living there, the politics. That all contributes to the way they work, and you can't just have one size fits all. You've got to devise a framework which actually allows people to govern land management activities, not just do the work. So communities have got to be the ones who decide on what activities happen on their land. They've got to decide, make sure the right cultural input is involved, the right outcomes are discussed and determined, and then the right people do the work. It may be the ranger group, it might not be the ranger group. There's a whole range of people up there with skills. There might be just a men's ranger group, and there might be a whole lot of women's work that needs to be done. there's a larger community to tap into. So there's got to be budget for participatory planners to work with Aboriginal communities to help them actually devise these community hubs. I'll just very quickly talk about South Australia and the Alanjara Wallara Natural Resource Management Board. Ooh, I'll go quickly. Okay, this area is actually 26% of South Australia in the northwest of the state, and it's largely set aside for conservation and traditional Aboriginal use and occupation. The region's owned by and trusted by 3 key land holding authorities, and they've got some major threats to national sources. There's a lack of traditional management, Aboriginal science. There's a loss of and lack of. They're finding it difficult to get the resource balance right. That's between cultural, biodiversity, and economic development. There's a lack of knowledge and information about the health and trends of natural resources, baseline data. I think that's a common problem. And there's also, unsustainable use of groundwater, big problems from feral pests. So that's different to the Northern Territory in that there's less Indigenous Rangers involved. They've got IPAs and they've got co-managed reserves and threatened species projects, but it's not like the Northern Territory, which you actually have people covering the landscape, Aboriginal people managing and covering the landscape. So they're still developing programs. There's less Aboriginal involvement NRM than Northern Territory. So in that area, how do you involve traditional owners? Well, there's got to be integration of the fee-for-service process. So once again, there's got to be a framework and a clearinghouse to link buyers and providers. And this message has come across, from 3 different NRM boards: the Territory NRM board, the AW NRM board, the Air NRM board have independently highlighted a need for a clearinghouse somewhere for the 2 sides to meet. There's got to be a change in the MBI language. It's got to be more understandable. It's got to be facilitation and mentoring to help groups understand how they can be involved. And there's got to be assistance in setting up contracts so that the community has actually capacity to deliver with appropriate outcomes. So what are the ways forward? Well, first of all, we have to understand how Indigenous natural and cultural resource management is operating. So we have to create a database of some of the current activities that are happening and who the hosting organisations are. So it means sort of detailing what the core activities, what the fee-for-service activities are, what the enterprise development activities are. That's some of the work's been done. Who the current funders are and what the opportunities and constraints are to this model of delivery. Then we've got to look at ways to broaden the market investment in Indigenous natural and cultural resource management and land management. So we've got to break down all the activities that are happening on land within programs into fee-for-service activities and set up a pathway, an interface for the buyers to meet the providers. It's got to be in governance centres and there's got to be greater corporate engagement. There's also got to be identify ways of influencing participation by the broader Aboriginal communities. So training capacity and helping them actually create the right sort of environment to actually make and deliver these contracts. Commonwealth government's doing some work. They just recently put out a tender to look at what NRM-based activities were happening on country, who the potential buyers are and who the ones into the future and what the constraints might be. Some of the federal agency staff have actually been trained on corporate engagement to try and encourage other buyers into the mix. Myself, through all the Land Council, I'm strategic planning with the ranger groups to look at what activities they're doing and how to actually broaden the income that they're generating from things outside of their core funding. There needs to be work done on interface, and there needs to be more facilitation with the rangers and community groups and support organisations, finding out how they want to connect. Last slide. What are the main points here? Well, MBIs are playing an increasingly important role in regional land management across Australia. To date, traditional owners have actually been, especially in Northern Territory, quite involved in these price-based MBI programs. It's important that this continues. And if MBIs are going to take more of an open market-orientated approach, then there needs to be thought put into developing an appropriate framework. And then on ground, different communities are going to want to engage in different ways. So there needs to be participatory planning to actually allow opportunity for this. And if these communities are actually engaged and informed and involved in delivery of NRM through FFS, then there's going to be a lot more great opportunity for empowerment, for them to actually have real empowerment in land management where they have control of it, and this will have spin-off livelihood and improve benefits through economic and employment. So sorry, that was all a bit fast, but there's actually, if anyone's interested in finding out a bit more about what's happening on Aboriginal land, there's a book that came out a few years ago, Investing in Indigenous Natural Resource Management. and that's through the CDU press. You can actually get on the website and order it, and you can have a look at it. It's actually got some really good information in there. But yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks, Julie.